This is a brief overview of our lecture on realism. I realize some of you missed this lecture because of a fire alarm, so do take care to speak to your classmates on how to bulk out your notes based on this in your readings. Today you should come away from the lecture with an ability to understand what the dominant theories of international relations are going to be. Today we're talking about realism, so you should be able to identify its main tenets. In short, you should have an understanding of power, self-interest, and anarchy. And finally, you should be able to link some of the ideas and authors together, and we worked on that in the lecture. So today the slides take you through a basic concept of realism. We then look at different types of realism. I talk you through structural realism 1, structural realism 2, and historical realism, drawing on your text from and the chart from Baylis and Smith. We then talk briefly about realism conflict, and we hint at some of the challenges that realism faced based on your assigned weekly reading of the Molloy article. When you're thinking about realism, you have to do it in the context of the origin stories that we talked about in the opening weeks of the module. I did hint at this notion of the Great Debate that happened in the 1930s and the 40s, and I pointed to the fact that many people say that this Great Debate, combined with the Westphalian origin story, come to bring you the standard account of international relations. So in short, realism 1. So this is something you need to bear in mind. Realism challenges both this idea of idealism and utopianism, and we see this happening in Wilson's 14-point address, which we talked about in class. Realism talks about power as being the focus of politics, and we are not talking about goodness and becoming a better person or creating a better community. Power is, in this sense, tied to the actions of states. We are not talking about individuals, and we did in class talk about the idea of the state as a black box, and the idea that we need to do this because politics at the end of the day is a competition. So what happens when we start to say that there is a tension between power and the primacy of the state? Well, you begin to focus on politics as interests and not necessarily on ideology, and the way that you achieve a situation of non-violence, or there is no conflict, is to do this by acquiring strength. Now, just because we don't have conflict doesn't necessarily mean we have peace. We just mean that people are not fighting, and you ensure that there is no fighting by acquiring power. And in class we talked about different ways that you might do this. Another thing that you have to take in mind is the idea of great powers. And how their experiences in the world are also going to complement this idea and this need to acquire strength to mitigate the worst forms of conflict in the international system. Realism has three basic tenets. There's the concept of the state, there's the concept of anarchy, and there's the concept of survival. And we talked about each of these in detail during the lecture. If you want to remember the idea of realism very generally, you can say it has three S's: the state, survival, and self-help. Now, that might be the beginning of a definition of what realism is, but if you stop there, that is definitely not enough. And in class, we talked about different ways of bulking out that particular idea. Here we have some pictures of various real thinkers. Starting on this side, we have Kenneth Waltz, who's written Man, the State, and War. He's also written International Theory, and that might be a book that you'd be interested in as well. Here we have Reinhold Niebuhr, where he's written The Children of Light and Darkness. We have Hans Morgenthau, who wrote Politics Among Nations, but I did suggest reading his other book, Scientific Man. It might be more interesting for you. And here we have E.H. Carr, who wrote The 20 Years Crisis, and we reference these books in the slides. So, if we go back to the core concepts of realism, there's a few things you need to think about. Anarchy, as encapsulated in the state of nature and sovereignty, the balance of power, and hegemonic stability theory. I was very clear in class that anarchy in international relations has a very specific definition, so do make sure that you understand what it means. In short, it is the absence of a higher governing authority. This lack of authority comes from the fact that there is nobody in charge of the international system, and we talked about this at length during class. So you do have scholars and individuals that suggest to you that the international system is very much like a state of nature, and here they're drawing on the idea of Hobbes, something that is talked about in your Baylis and Smith textbook. So the idea that states are similar to a solitary man, and what they want to do is they want to preserve themselves. They want to stay safe, and they don't want to die. The argument within a realist framework is that states have this natural right to secure their survival, and they look at different ways in the international system of doing this, and this is where international sovereignty helps. So there is a relationship between anarchy and sovereignty. Sovereignty becomes, or is rather, the principle for establishing an independent working relationship between states in the international system. It has 4 aspects: juridical, observable, empirical, and legal, and we talked about some of those in class as well. But basically, sovereignty exists and supports 2 particular ideas. The idea of non-intervention, so one state cannot intervene into the domestic affairs of another state, and the doctrine of formal equality, the idea that all states are, by their very nature, equal. Now, obviously, there are some problems with these 2 doctrines, and we talked about those at length. And we did talk about them in relation to a Westphalian system, especially since in previous weeks we've looked at the challenges to Westphalia. Anarchy and sovereignty for a realist comes together and creates an international system. And this is to be contrasted with an international society, which is put forward by various alternative ways of interpreting international relations, chiefly the English school and more liberal interpretations. But basically, what you get in an international system is that you have authority within the state, so an elected government, and you have justice within there. But outside of the state, there's no sense of justice, there's no sense of law, and there's no authority. And this is why you need to be strong, you need to have strength in order to ensure that you can take care of yourself. So within that, we have a couple different concepts that we want to explore. The first is the balance of power. And balance of power is one way of understanding how this coexistence, how the absence of conflict is achieved. So a balance of power exists when there's equality or stability among competing forces, so between states. And the idea of the balance of power is that the idea that one state does not become so powerful that it can do whatever it wants, that it becomes the dominant force. At this stage, if you have a balance of power, then no one state can exert its force unilaterally, and therefore everybody is acting as a check and a balance on everybody else. Now, this particular idea, balance of power, is contrasted with, say, what we call the hegemonic stability theory. Hegemonic stability theory centers around the idea that there is one state that is a hegemon. You can also refer to a hegemon as a superpower. And the superpower, so you can think of the United States and the former Soviet Union during the Cold War, they have the ability to create and enforce international norms, what states are and are not allowed to do. But they also have the desire, they want to create these types of norms, and they can enforce them. So they have to be strong economically, technologically, and they must have some form of military dominance as well. Again, the Cold War is the chief example of this type of idea. There are a few things associated with the hegemonic stability theory. The first is that the hegemon will only support a particular system if it's in its best interest to do so. So again, this can be tied back to anarchy. There is an underlying current of coercion in this particular type of system. And so, with that, if things change, if it's not in the best interest of the hegemon to maintain this particular system, they will try and change it. So the stability and the long-term maintenance of a particular system within this approach depends on a superpower to do its job. Now, those are the basic concepts. Here, I presented you with a chart taken directly from Bayliss and Smith of how we can break down realism. Now, this comes with the traditional caveat: when something is presented this easily to you, you should always take care and wonder what is not being told. And this was something that Ashworks talked about in the week when we looked at origin stories. So you can break realism down, and they suggest that you can have structural realism 1, and that is associated with Thucydides and Hans Morgenstern. You can have historical or practical realism, and they associate that with Machiavelli and E.H. Carr. You can have structural realism 2, which is associated with individuals like Rousseau and Waltz. And you can have something that they call liberal realism, that they associate with Hobbes and Hedley Bull. And then in this column here, you've got the various texts that are associated with the authors. Now, in what follows, I'm going to take you very, very quickly through each of these categories, but I'm going to leave it up to you to tie the authors and the ideas to the individuals that we've been talking about. So, structural realism 1 talks about international politics driven by an endless desire for power. So this goes to the heart of the idea that the international system propels and promotes competition. And it's that competition that fuels crisis and conflict. So the idea, though, is that this desire for power is rooted in our human nature. We are built this way and we cannot escape it. So, following on from this, justice, law, society don't have a place in the international system, and if they do exist, they are not natural or organic. They are artificially created, so they are the creations of states. You can see these ideas evidenced in the ideas of Hans Morgenthau, in particular Scientific Man versus Power Politics, but also Politics Among Nations. And this book very quickly really does buy into the idea that we have a negative human nature. States are egotistical. And the idea that we can have a moral international community is impossible because we don't have an international conscience and we don't make deliberations in the same way that individuals do when we come together collectively. And I take you through some of the various ideas that Morgenthau talks about. Moving on to historical realism, here you get the idea that political realism recognizes that principles are subordinate to policies. So what does this mean? The ultimate skill of the state leader is to accept and to adapt to changing power political configurations in world politics. So in essence, nothing stays the same, and you have to be aware of those changing dynamics if you want to achieve that survival that we've been talking about. You see this idea embodied in the writings of E.H. Carr, and in particular his 20 Years Crisis. In this book, you get a really interesting interweaving or examination of how realism and idealism play out against one another. And in this book, he's looking, as you can see in the title, in those interwar years. And he's using that to give his particular interpretation of politics. Now, you do have to bear in mind that this approach has been criticized, and we talked about this in the contents of an article by Peter Wilson. But what comes out of this book and what is important to take away from that is this idea that you're always wanting to be on top, that politics is about supremacy, and that caught up within this desire for supremacy is the concept of power, which is tied to a realist interpretation of the world, but also this self-interest that propels the states to move forward. What's really interesting is in this book is that there's a role for ethics and morality within politics, albeit relative and a functional role. So you're starting to see a contrast in the different authors that I've introduced you to. Moving on to structural realism 2, we have a challenge to the idea that conflict is innate. It does not necessarily start from a place that is embedded within us as individuals or within the states. Instead, what we're looking at is a systematic level of analysis. So you're looking at the way that the international system is set up, and you're asking questions about, well, what within that system propels us towards conflict. So all of a sudden, you're talking about fear, jealousy, suspicion, and insecurity. And we had a brief chat in class about the interesting idea that these are all individual-based emotions that start within the individual, and how might those actually be transposed onto the state, and whether or not this is a problem. But what comes out of this is, because it's a structural interpretation and not an individual interpretation, you have this notion that conflict can just pop up when you least expect it, at whatever is the most benign of moments. And you see this type of analysis in the writing of Kenneth Waltz, and he wrote Man, the State, and War in 1959, and he wrote a theory of international politics in 1978. And what's really interesting is that he looks at 3 different levels to understand political conflict. He looks at the individual level, the state level, and the structural level. And it's within this structural analysis that he provides us with an understanding of war comes from. Kenneth Waltz is particularly interesting as well, because this is where we get this iteration that the state is a black box, that you can't open it up. And we talked about this, and I used the analogy of billiard balls to understand how states bump up against one another in the international system. And it's in this book that the idea of self-preservation and security is really reinforced. And he says we don't actually need to look inside the state to understand where conflict is coming from. So things like nationality, religion, social custom, they aren't necessarily the sources of conflict. Conflict comes from anarchy. And if you recall in that very first slide, set of slides, we talked about what international relations understands anarchy to be, and we get back to this idea that there is a lack of a higher governing authority in the international system. So I then go on to take you through some of the concepts that Kenneth Waltz talked about before, bringing it back to the core concepts of realism. Okay, the rules of the game are quite simple. We seek stability, there's a focus on state interest, and we're trying to avoid the anarchy of war. Okay. And that is what we need to remember. But I also give you cautions. The story is not necessarily this simple. And I suggest to you that there are different ways of interpreting realism, international relations, that you will go on to discuss in the second year. Thank you.